So this is a question from Kyle Moray 8838. Thank you very much for the question. And he says, would ever teach on your channel how to speak Italian with Sicilian accent or a breakdown of how Sicilians speak Italian? I'm learning Italian. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for learning my language, meaning Italian, and I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate very much your interest into specifically my region, and therefore I imagine my culture, because at the end of the day, language is an expression of culture. So how would I answer this question specifically? Well, let me give you a little bit of an introduction very quickly, and perhaps I'll make this into a series, we'll see. But just to give you a general idea, in Sicily, Sicilians today speak Italian and Sicilian. And oftentimes these two, even though they are separate languages, because I mean Sicilian is a regional language, although in Italian we call it un dialetto, so a dialect. But the reality is that we would have to go into social linguistics and what the actual difference between a language and a dialect is. And I don't really want to bore you to death with all the details of the linguistics of it. So let's just say for a moment that Italian and Sicilian sometimes are mutually intelligible, but so are Spanish and Italian, and so are Portuguese and Italian, and other times they are not. And oftentimes the distance between Sicilian and Standard Italian is quite significant, to a point of not being able to understand each other, particularly when it's the older generation. But today, if you were to set foot in Sicily right now, what language would you hear? And the reality of fact is that you would hear both. Of course, very much depends on whether you go to a big city or whether you go to a rural area, because clearly if you go to a rural area, then the chances of hearing more Sicilian than Italian are going to be significantly higher. On the other hand, if you go to a main city, if you enter an establishment or if you enter a restaurant, you might hear them speak Sicilian, but they might also be speaking Italian. Kind of depends on the area as well and who's speaking to who. But with that same situation, if you go to a university, for instance, and you listen to a lecture, it's going to be Italian 100% of the time. And Italian is going to be the language used during tests. You will never hear a student deliberately speaking Sicilian during a test to a teacher, to a university professor, unless they're taking a test in Sicilian, I suppose. Meaning like they're studying Sicilian. But this is really the idea of speaking the language in their pure versions. But the mixing happens, and it happens a lot. So what happens to us Sicilians is that, imagine that I'm walking around with my friends, and we are like 16-year-olds, all right? We will be speaking quite a bit of Sicilian, but we will also use Italian, and it really depends on which area you were brought up. Like, for instance, I was brought up in an area in Palermo where, in fact, Italian is the majority language. So every time I'm leaving my apartment, because you've got a lot of flats in Sicily, you have a concierge in these flats. So there is a guy, a custodian. And so every time I would speak to him, I would speak Italian to him. I would be like, buongiorno, come va, tutto bene? Grazie, arrivederci. It's all Italian. However, when my mates are with me, one of them, Salvatore, he was brought up in an area of Palermo called Zen. In that area, you'll hear mostly Sicilian. Now, you will hear Italian as well. But with him, also because it was fun, we would often speak Sicilian when we were joking, we're having fun, but then we would switch back to Italian. And we can switch like that, on and off, even mid-sentence, and Sicilians do it all the time. Now, if I were to speak to an older person, sometimes they will only use Sicilian. That does happen. But other times, we will use Italian. And it's a contextual choice. Once again, has to do with the social aspect of languages and the way language functions, specifically when a regional language is relegated to the dialect status. But just to say that, depending on where you go, and depending on who you speak, and what generation they're from, you might end up only using Italian, you might end up mixing, and you might end up only using Sicilian. Another thing that I want to mention as a way to kind of contextualize this even further is the fact that there isn't one single Sicilian. Sicily is extremely linguistically diverse. And that is because it being the main island in the center of the Mediterranean basin, it's an island that has had lots of different conquests. We've got the Romans, we've got the Phoenicians, we've got the Greeks, the Arabs, we've got the Normans, we've got Spanish domination, and all of these have left significant imprint into the different varieties of Sicilian. So in a way, the way we speak in Palermo, as opposed to the way they speak in Catania, Agrigento, Messina, Trapani, Gela, Canicattì, Siracusa, the word order, the grammar structure, the syntax, terms that we use, the intonation and pronunciation will be very different because they mirror the linguistic and cultural baggage that comes from the history behind these dominations and the populations that have stayed in one area as opposed to the other. Of course, between Sicilians, we do have common areas or sections of linguistic overlap, but other times the words we use are completely different. Like, for instance, as someone from Palermo, if I had to translate the Italian word ragazzo, ragazzi, which means boy, boys, I would say picciotto, picciotti. That's my way of saying boy, boys. But if you were to ask someone in Catania, they would say carusu, carusi. Very different. Now, of course, I will probably make a video with all the different significant main differences in vocabulary between Italian and Sicilian. I think that could be fun, and also the areas of overlap.